I didn't flee India. I migrated as what one might call a sexual migrant in the 70s. I much admired people like Peter Tatchell at the time, who were campaigning for gay liberation in Britain, and Britain was obviously a much more welcoming place to be. And India, not in my family, who were very westernized and liberal, as a lot of westernized liberal people are. But there was deeply entrenched homophobia, especially in more traditional conservative families. And it's been there, much before Macaulay introduced Section 377 in the Penal Code. He was reflecting local custom. Under Hindu and Muslim traditional law, it was punishable by death.
Yeah, so
Zareer, Macaulay wasn't in.
Yeah, you're saying it was there before, and actually I'm wondering, as a former BBC man, you were at the BBC for many years, Zareer, what do you make of this? Would you say actually it's historically illiterate?
I don't think Tom Daley is a historian. I think he probably meant well. I think he's sort of misguided and he doesn't understand. I grew up in India. I'm very much part of that culture as well. So I understand how deep the roots are. And let's not forget, it was a British colonial introduced court, the Delhi High Court, which repealed Section 377 a few years ago, and it was the Supreme Court, which again derived from colonial times, which upheld that. So, I don't think it's the colonial legacy. I think it's deeply entrenched culture. Homophobia goes back millennia.
So, Zareer Masani, before I bring in Peter Tatchell there, I just want to ask, do you think that people are perhaps too fast to constantly point the blame at the British Empire for some of the evils that still exist in the world?
Well, I think it's very easy to pin the blame on something that is 75 years gone, instead of looking at your own society as it is today. I think that's true of many African countries. I think, you only have to go to most traditional Black or Asian households in Britain to ask them what their views on homophobia are, and to ask young gay Black and Asian people what it's like to grow up in those communities. And I don't think they got it from British colonialism.
So, Peter Tatchell, then, you've been, as Zareer said in his opening remarks there, you've been a campaigner and activist in LGBT equality for many years now. What did you actually make of this documentary and what it said about the British Empire and colonialism's after effect, I guess?
Well, the first thing to be said is that in the vast majority of the 35 Commonwealth countries that still criminalise same-sex relations, those are laws that were originally imposed by Britain when it was the colonial power in the 19th century. The vast majority of those countries had no laws against homosexuality. Indeed, in many traditional tribal cultures, same-sex relations were either accepted or tolerated. So, for example, I have a friend from Nigeria. His great-grandmother told him before she died that, yes, they had people like that in the village, and it was a live and let live attitude. It was only when Britain came in that the draconian sentences were imposed. And today there are 7 Commonwealth countries that have life imprisonment. And that particular penalty was most definitely imposed by Britain as the colonial power in the 19th century. So those were the facts. But however, of course, those countries are now independent. And they can't keep on blaming Britain because they have the right and authority as independent nations to change those laws, and they haven't. And that's the big issue. We have to acknowledge the colonial past and the legacy, but those countries are independent, and it's now up to them to change the law. And so they should, because they've all signed up to the Commonwealth Charter. And the Commonwealth Charter says very clearly that every Commonwealth citizen in every Commonwealth country has a right to equal treatment and protection against discrimination. That does not square with criminalisation. So those countries are defying the Commonwealth Charter that they themselves have signed and have pledged to uphold.
OK. Peter, would you argue then that watching this documentary, do you feel a deep sense of shame to be British?
No, I don't feel shame because I had nothing to do with it, you know. But of course, I regret that Britain did impose these laws, and that, you know, as a consequence, many millions of LGBT plus people in Commonwealth countries have lived under very draconian legislation. Many have been imprisoned, and in a few cases suffered much worse. You know, there are Commonwealth countries where there are no laws against homosexuality, but mob violence exists, and often the police and local authorities take no action against the perpetrators. In fact, just recently in Uganda, some LGBT plus people reported violent thefts and assaults. And when they went to the police, they were arrested and faced charges, not their assailants.
So, Dr. Zareer Masani, after hearing all that from Peter Tatchell, surely you'll be tweeting out this documentary now. You'll be saying, well done, Tom Daley, for shining a light on the evils of Britain's past.
No, look, I agree with Peter that the British Empire legislated in ways that pre-colonial regimes didn't, and that didn't apply just to sexuality. It was to a whole raft of things, because legislation in the Western sense came in with the British Empire. However, Peter, I'm sure, will recognize that there's a huge gap between law and practice. And I think, you know, laws may legalize or illegalize homosexuality. The actual attitudes to homosexuals may be very different. So, I mean, now India repealed the Section 377 legislation a few years ago. It hasn't really changed attitudes to homosexuals. Most gay people I know are in the closet. They wouldn't dare to come out because their families wouldn't approve. Nothing to do with the law. It's cultural. It's shame. It's heterosexuality is the public norm, and we have to distinguish between the public and the private. There's a lot of homosexual activity that goes on undercover behind the scenes, especially in rural areas where men sleep in dormitories next to each other, are segregated from women. But that doesn't mean it's publicly accepted. They still marry and have children.